sleep. Bus, club, another club, plane, next place, no sleep.
Why does every single episode of The Pitt make you feel like you got hit by a bus? When I was rewatching the first season and taking notes on it, I wrote down in my notebook that episode 8 was so sad it borderline felt unethical. It really made me think of the kind of toll that it was taking on me emotionally to watch a show that is so dramatic and so intense. The Pitt is a medical drama produced by HBO that follows the ER team at PTMC, Pittsburgh Trauma Medical Center. Each season is one shift at the ER, and each episode is one real-time hour of that shift. The first season started airing in January 2025 with a week-by-week release, and at the time of recording, we're about 2/3 of the way through the airing of the second season. As I said, when I was rewatching the first season, I was very taken by just how emotional an experience it was, and how closely I identified with literally every single character that was on screen, even though they all had such drastically different perspectives, challenges, and experiences. It made me think a lot about the concept of cinematic ethics, and just how well positioned medical shows specifically are to address really contemporary and poignant social issues. I was also very taken by how the structure of the show allowed for an emotional and even physical alignment between the audience and the things that were happening on screen, and how this generation of affect within the viewer could sway the interpretation of the show's plot. So just a few disclaimers, I'll really be focusing on season 1 of the show because it's fully aired. When I do mention season 2, it'll be very minimal spoilers, but I will make it really clear, so if you want to, you can just skip ahead. Also, I'm not a medical professional, so when it comes to the medical elements of the plot that I will be mentioning, take everything I say with a grain of salt. I try my best to understand, but I'm really focusing on the interpersonal relationships on the show and much less so on the actual medical events that are being addressed. And the last thing is that I'm going to really try to stick to just using the last names of the doctors and make it really clear who I'm referring to for anyone who maybe hasn't seen the show. But if it slips out, I apologize. I'll try and make it clear on screen. Also, it's sad because you guys can't see how cute my mug is. Look how cute she is, but I have to hold it this way. She's being silenced. As I mentioned before, I think that the medical show is such an interesting subgenre when it comes to depicting and problematizing these latent and accepted social forces. I say this honestly having not seen any other medical shows, okay? I never watched Grey's, no hate to Grey's, but I just it was never my thing until I watched The Pitt. But without even having seen any of those other shows, I think it's pretty easy to understand that because the medical show is dealing with people's health, it automatically opens the door to very broad questions about life and death, kind of the very basis of our society, the very things that people contemplate and had been contemplating for all of time, not to be too dramatic. It also opens the door to the very specific social occasions of the patient. So you kind of have the broad and the specific married in this really interesting and I think generative way. When it comes to ethics, the specific frame I want to use to analyze The Pitt is going to be taken from Robert Sinnerbrink's book, Cinematic Ethics, Exploring Ethical Experience for Film. So to just get a basic understanding of how cinema and ethics might be related, here's how Sinnerbrink explains the power of cinema in relation to the ethical experience. Quote, "It can even expose us to morally confronting, ethically estranging, and emotionally challenging forms of experience that demand some kind of philosophical response on our part. An effort of thinking to which we might otherwise remain oblivious or that we might otherwise prefer to ignore." The thing that really sticks out to me there is that last part, prefer to ignore. In episode 9, one of Dr. McKay's patients from early in the day returns to the ER having gotten into a really severe car crash. Dr. Collins then suggests to McKay that she may have failed to provide an adequate standard of care to this patient because she was overweight. McKay's very clearly taken aback by the suggestion, but she does take a moment to reflect on how her weight may have impacted the care that she provided. McKay obviously doesn't want to believe that she would be capable of discriminating against somebody because of their weight. And an audience member who might find themselves in kinship with that patient will also find themselves forcibly confronted by the disparate realities of medical care. We're all probably aware in some capacity that these social forces do exist and these biases do exist and impact medical care, but such a direct confrontation probably forces us to reconsider our own social world and experiences, and that points to the kind of philosophical responses Sinnerbrink is describing. Season 2, spoiler, very, very mild. There's an interesting continuation with this McKay storyline in season 2 when there's an overweight patient named Howard whose weight presents difficulties in trying to get a CT scan and presents elevated risks during his surgery. McKay is also assigned to this case, and she kind of takes on a mentorship role to Ogilvy, who's one of the new medical students who's being very unempathetic to the whole situation. So in the advice that she gives to Ogilvy, we can kind of see a continuation of this moment of rupture and how it can actually concretely affect her decisions moving forward and her ethical encounters with patients that are overweight. So we can see from this very small example a baseline of how cinema has the power to prompt ethical reflection. Sinnerbrink then breaks down cinematic ethics into 3 more distinct but very much interrelated categories. Quote, 3 aspects of the relationship between film, spectator, and context. 1. Ethics in cinema. Focusing on narrative content, including dramatic scenarios involving morally charged situations, conflicts, decisions, or actions. 2. The ethics, politics of cinematic representation. Focusing on the ethical issues raised by elements of film production and/or audience reception, for example, ongoing debates over the effects of screen violence. And 3, the ethics of cinema as a cultural medium expressing moral beliefs, social values, or ideology. So these 3 dimensions of cinema, which can obviously also be applied to television, work together to create a complex ethical experience for the viewer. I think that the clearest example to examine each one of these ethical dimensions is the plotline of David throughout season 1. So David was an 18-year-old boy who lives alone with his mother Teresa after his father passed away during COVID. He's had a really difficult time in school since his father's passing, and when his mom finds what seems to be a hit list hidden in his room, she makes herself sick so that he's forced to bring her to the ER where she can hopefully find someone to help him. David ends up being falsely suspected of being the mass shooter who causes the mass casualty incident at the end of the season and is eventually placed on an involuntary psych hold. So let's go through this plotline through each of the 3 dimensions that Sinnerbrink outlines. So first we have ethics in cinema. I think that the ethical element of this plotline is pretty clear. It deals very explicitly with the themes of toxic masculinity and ties it to mass shootings. Dr. Ravi very plainly states the issues that plague young men today. He says, "We tell them to man up and they get their lessons from toxic podcasts. They find comfort in all the wrong places." There's also the very clear ethical dilemma of how best to help David, which is really triangulated by Dr. Robbie, Dr. McKay, and Teresa. Teresa largely seems willing to offload the responsibility of helping her son onto somebody else. Dr. Robbie seems inclined to give David a chance to prove himself, and Dr. McKay, who has had experiences with violent men in the past, is really pushing to report him to the police. Then we have ethics of cinematic representation. When this season was airing, I do vaguely remember some online discourse about how well this plotline was or wasn't handled, specifically when it came to the police involvement. I would also raise the nuancing question of what it means for all the characters involved in this specific plotline to be white, as well as the kind of power and gender dynamics that exist between Robbie, who's a male attending, and McKay, who's a female resident. All right, it's been a few days since I was filming, but I had to jump in and add this because we just got news that Supriya Ganesh, who plays Dr. Samira Mohan, will not be returning for season 3, which is maybe some of the most devastating news I've ever received. Now, this is especially sad because, in my opinion, Dr. Mohan is one of the best written characters on the show, and she's also one of 2 South Asian characters who has a regular recurring role on the show alongside Victoria Javadi. This has obviously generated a lot of conversation online, and I think it's very directly linked to the conversation that we were having about the ethics of cinematic representation. It's especially interesting because she's only the 2nd cast member to formally exit the show after Tracy Ifficher, who plays Dr. Heather Collins in season 1. Even with Tracy's exit, which was honestly shrouded in a bit more confusion, there was still controversy over the only Black woman who was a recurring lead role on the show being cut. Now, I personally think it's extremely sad for the only 2 formal exits from the show thus far to have been women of color. I definitely don't think this makes the writers racist by any means, but it's definitely not a good look when we look at who is being represented on screen. Anyway, back to regularly scheduled programming, but I was really upset and I had to add in my thoughts on that. And finally, we have ethics of cinema as a cultural medium. I think that this is where the Pitt is actually in a very unique position because it explicitly seeks to address the issues of our social world in a very realistic way. Its realism, which we will get to later, is what a lot of the advertising and word of mouth was focused on, about how this is the most realistic medical drama of all time, and it shows what it's like to work in the ER right now in contemporary times. It's definitely a line that I've used when I'm trying to get people to watch and positioning it in opposition to other shows like Grey's Anatomy, which don't take this realist approach. But because its ethics in cinema is directly tied to its ethics as cinema as cultural medium, who exactly is coloring the beliefs of the show and who's producing it become really important considerations. In the context of this specific plotline, I think it ends up taking a pretty middle-of-the-road approach. It's clearly invested in having an empathetic take and helping troubled teens and figuring out what issues led to this structural breakdown, but it could also be argued that this ends up being a no-sides approach, which appeals to every member of the political spectrum. Again, with a slight spoiler for season 2, there has been an ICE storyline that's been developing, and there have been lots of discussions about it on social media. Now, this is very much alleged, and again from social media buzz, But allegedly, the ICE plotline was originally meant to be a little more explicitly harsh, and it was modified by HBO producers to be a more moderate take. Now, if this is true, it would have happened prior to the recent escalation of ICE in the US, but obviously ICE has been a long-standing problem and very problematic social force in the United States, to put it in very generous terms. Right now, the arc is not complete, so I really don't think I can take any decisive statements. However, I would say that it's not being kind to ICE by any means, but if it was supposed to go further and there are forces that are making them be softer, I think that's definitely something to consider when we're talking about TV as a cultural medium, reflecting ethical values. The other reality is that the show is airing now, whether it was written 6 months ago, 5 years ago, or yesterday, it doesn't really matter. It's impossible not to read it through the current political lens. I think the cultural medium aspect also becomes a concern when we think about the recent deal for HBO and Warner Brothers to be acquired by Paramount. So for those who are maybe unfamiliar with the studio system, the head of Paramount, David Ellison, is a longtime supporter and close collaborator of the Trumps. Now, this is concerning and upsetting for like a laundry list of reasons, but one of them is the potential for very increased crackdowns of what kind of content is or is not permitted. This might seem extreme, and it may have seemed extreme like 10 years ago, but we've seen time and time again that the Trump regime has no problem with censorship. It tries to ban books. It got Stephen Colbert canceled, allegedly directly following his criticism of Trump. So within just this one plotline, we can see how many tensions emerge, and this season is just chock full of social issues and ethical dilemmas. Just to name a few, we have homelessness, abortion, unions, insurance, weight biases, race, and that really barely scratches the surface. So how can each of these dimensions complicate the other? How can we understand Robbie's unwillingness to involve the cops as a reflection of the studio that produced it? Can we even see it as a reflection of the studio that produced it? How would the situation be presented if David or any of the other characters hadn't been white? I think these questions are kind of the point of the show. I think that we're meant to view these things in a dialectical relationship with one another rather than taking the events of the plot as ethical fact or truth. Now, to all three of these considerations, we have to add a fourth dimension. Quote, "To these three dimensions, we can add a fourth, the aesthetic dimension of cinema. In particular, the role of aesthetic form in intensifying our experience, refining and focusing our attention, and thus of conveying complexity of meaning through manifold means, as a way of evoking ethical experience and thereby inviting further ethical critical reflection." Now, we'll get a bit more into the Pitt specific formal features in the next section, but I think it's pretty easy to understand that the aesthetics and atmosphere of a piece of media will greatly impact the perception a viewer has of it. This can take place from small scale to large scale. We can ask how different the Pitt would feel if it was set in space, which would be a pretty dramatic shift, but we can also ask how it already feels so different from other medical dramas like Grey's Anatomy. Now, I think the specific way that the Pitt's aesthetics contribute to its ethical landscape is through its production of affect, or the physical impact felt through the screen onto the viewer. As Carl Plantinga writes in his book, Moving Viewers, quote, "Effective mimicry is generated by the grain of the voice, subtle inflections of tone and cadence, facial expressions, gestures, and postures. Effective mimicry results from the spectator's experience of photographic and oral representations of the human body and voice. We are a species of mimics, and various sorts of motor mimicry strongly affect spectators without them being consciously aware of it." So to put it very briefly, affect implies that a film does not just portray an emotion, but actually elicits one from the viewer. This kind of emotional contagion, as Plantinga puts it, occurs due to our inherent ability as humans to understand what it feels like to feel human emotions and be in a human body, and replicate the physical responses we see on screen within our own bodies. The use of close-ups throughout the show are a really prime and simple example of how we can tune into the physical experiences of the characters on screen, and how audience members are inclined to project their own bodily and psychic experiences onto them. An example of this that I really love is this linger on Dr. Mohan breathing in episode 12. Though it's ultimately completely insignificant to the actual plot, this brief moment of pause amidst the complete chaos of the mass casualty incident grounds the viewer in Samira's breath. It places us in her physical and mental state, and perhaps prompts us to engage with her ethical interpretation of everything that's surrounding her. We can ask ourselves what she's considering in this moment. Is she contemplating the scale of the violence? Is she contemplating her ability or inability to process it, her ability or inability to put a stop to it? There's a similar example in the same episode when Chad, Dr. McKay's ex-husband, watches her while she's treating patients during the MCI. Reverse shots reveal the chaos of the ER, but we consistently return back to this close-up on Chad's face. He's very much out of his depth. Though we may become pretty accustomed to the perspective of the doctors we've been following throughout the season, who are very practiced at stealing off their emotions, as we will talk about later, These close-ups of Chad's horrified face really prompt us into problematizing the images on screen and take in the same horror that Chad is. In allowing close identification across various social groups, the Pit makes us consider a massive slew of ethical questions. The aesthetics mix very clearly with the plot and social context to generate a completely new set of ethical experiences. Now, what exactly is the point of all of these ethical encounters? Sinnerbrink writes, quote, "Morally approving or disapproving the characters may not be as important as ethical acknowledgement of their experiential perspective, even if this means inhabiting a discomforting, morally ambiguous point of view, leading to a deeper ethical understanding of how the exercise of moral agency might be undermined by the conflicting demands of their social situation." Now, this quote suggests a very frustrating but true-to-life answer, unfortunately. Ethical dilemmas are very rarely about finding the right answer. Unless you subscribe to a very strict moral code or philosophy, it can be difficult to prescribe the moral issues raised and the parties involved as simply right or wrong. Rather, these kinds of ethical identifications aim to simply put you in another person's shoes, develop a sense of empathy for these conflicting demands of someone else's social situation. It's really not about passing judgment, but about opening dialogue around broader social issues. The aesthetic and ethics in a plot become wholly entangled with cinema as a cultural medium and its reflection of these broader societal attitudes. How exactly would you characterize a Pit? Is it a drama? A pure medical drama? What do those terms even mean? People, including myself, love to say they sound like Grey's Anatomy, but if they're both medical dramas, then what actually makes that distinction accurate? I say this to foreground the discussion of genre by pointing out how these categories are really just meant as jumping off points for analysis rather than being analysis in and of themselves. It low-key doesn't matter if something's a drama or a comedy. What are you gonna do about that? Every piece of media within a given genre or stylistic lineage is gonna have something unique and distinct that makes it basically uncategorizable. Using established genres, though, can help create new meaning, and I think the Pit falls into a very interesting place between realism and melodrama that can help illuminate some of the thematic and ethical content of the show. So let's start by outlining what realism is. I think it's definitely the category most people would feel comfortable putting the Pit into. Like, as I was saying before, it was heavily used in the marketing and in the word of mouth campaign. I use it all the time, saying that it's the most realistic drama you're ever gonna see. So plainly put, realism is just about portraying the real in the most accurate and true to life way possible. So how does the Pit achieve this? First of all, it's told pretty much in real time. Each approximately hour-long episode of the show corresponds to an hour of the shift. It gives an accurate sense of pacing throughout the day, and you feel like you're living in real time with these characters. There are also several tracking shots and oneers which limit breaks in time and contribute to this real-time feeling where you feel like you're moving in pace with the characters. It also has a very limited score, and the emphasis is really on the sounds of the ER. They also use eye lines to transition between scenes, which allows for a very natural mapping of the space. The other way that they transition between scenes is when characters share a space and then one leaves and the camera continues tracking them. So some examples of this is this conversation between Mel and Samira, which punches out to Robbie walking with them in the background, which is a great example of continuity. I would also argue that the Pit falls into the category of social realism, which uses all of these techniques to portray the economic, political, social struggles of various groups in society. Now, how does this contrast to melodrama? Melodrama is generally less concerned with the aesthetic elements, though it definitely can have formal components as well. The most important aspect of melodrama is that it's a genre defined by excess, generally emotional excess. You can also frequently associate it with films like The Woman's Film or A Weepy. Sinnerbrink expands this to include the moral melodrama. He defines this as, quote, films that use melodrama, understood as an expressive mode, style, or genre, to elicit forms of effective responsiveness and emotional engagement that open up a space for sympathetic, ethical understanding achieved through aesthetic means. Now, a really common aesthetic mean to provoke emotion is scores. The Pit has a very limited score, but a recent example that actually generated a lot of discourse online was in the film Hamnet. The last scene is highly emotional, no spoilers, but it does use a piece called On the Nature of Daylight, which is just kind of known as being a really sad song. So when it starts playing, it indicates to the viewer that this is supposed to be an intensely emotional experience, and you're supposed to be sharing the emotions with Agnes, played by Jessie Buckley, on screen. I don't feel that the Pit really engages with these very prescriptive aesthetic tools, but it definitely deals with the excesses of life. I think that the mass shooting is a prime example of this. There are very few things more horrific than a mass shooting. It literally occupies a space in life defined by excess. There's a horrific excess of bodily harm, violence, and emotional reaction. Now, where I argue that the Pit falls into a very unique position is that the social issues that it's portraying, including the mass shooting, are drawn from real life events, even though it's dealing with the excess. I think that the intersection in the show between realism and melodrama actually end up providing a very distinct ethical experience. Let's talk about the use of tracking shots as an example. Tracking shots operate on a simultaneously realist and melodramatic mode. Here's a quote that I love about tracking shots from a critic named Vitaly Troianovsky. Quote, "The extra long tracking shot filmed in real time goes on, and you suddenly feel choked up from your proximity to another's soul." So while the tracking shot bases itself in real time, a realist sensibility, it also is building an effective relationship between the character and the viewer, which can allow us to experience any of these outsized melodramatic emotions. So the excess of emotions that are felt in melodrama cannot be avoided simply by using realist techniques. They may in fact be constitutive of each other. The Pitt's link between realism and melodrama became very clear to me through the repeated and failed attempts at emotional distancing that happened throughout the season. When Dr. Mel King asks an empty room if anyone has contacted the family of a deceased patient, her empathy is played as an outlier. Later in the season, she herself even claims that it's inconvenient for a doctor to have emotional reactions. But as the season goes on, every character begins to find it increasingly difficult to maintain these emotional barriers. Of course, there are instances of grief present throughout the entirety of the season, but it really builds to a palpable breaking point. This distancing could also be read as an attempt to preserve innocence in a socially difficult condition. This is where the ethical experience of both the viewers and the characters come in. Sinnerbrink writes that, quote, "This emphasis on innocence persecuted and emotional involvement within a morally ambiguous situation remains a mainstay of melodrama, whether it uses conventional melodramatic elements or recasts the melodramatic content using realist effects or style. The ER is a prime space for this loss of innocence. There are so many horrors that come through in so little time to process them, as we can see as Dr. Robbie lists all of the deaths that happened throughout the shift. The precarious preservation of innocence is emphasized through the use of space in the season. Only a turn back stops Robbie's stepson Jake from seeing his dead girlfriend, or McKay's young son from seeing the horrors of a mass shooting. There's also a consistent pattern of shooting these highly emotional moments through the window of a closed door, so you're kept on the outside. This happens with the young drowning victim, the parents of the coma patient, and many, many, many more. Shooting these moments through the doors recreates the experience of being in the ER yourself, knowing horrible things are happening around you but not having full access to them. Or alternatively, intentionally removing yourself from these emotionally destabilizing encounters, especially in the context of a staff member, to block them out from your own psyche. It's an attempted but failed rejection of excess and attempted but failed preservation of innocence. So unfortunately, we have to talk about the absolute saddest case in the season, which is the young girl who drowns. I think this serves as the key pivotal example of the dissolution of these emotional barriers and the interplay between realism and melodrama. At about the midpoint of the season, a young girl is brought in by her grandmother after drowning in the backyard pool. Her younger sister had fallen into the water and she jumped in to save her, which she did, but unfortunately she herself was not able to survive. After her death, the show rests on the reactions of many of the staff members in the ER. As Dr. King sits with the victim's young sister, the camera holds a close-up as she processes the young girl's shattering of innocence. Later, she sits at a desk and a slow push-in lingers as she listens to calming ocean sounds. Dr. Langdon steps outside to call his kids, just wanting to hear their voices. As the cleaning staff resets the trauma room, there's a long pause on the hair bow that was left behind. Each of these characters are part of their own social realities and are prompted into individual reflections based on their positionality. Dr. King is thinking about her sister, Dr. Langdon about his children. The use of close-ups throughout this episode produces an effective response within the viewers, allowing them to engage with the emotional and ethical experience of each of these characters. Sinnerbrink writes, quote, "The effective intensity, emotional pathos, and hyperbolic aesthetics of melodrama point, rather, to the otherwise inarticulable clash between individual desires or social aspirations and the possibility or impossibility of their practical fulfillment within the normative context of a given social cultural world. Whatever reality these characters want to keep at bay cannot help but leak in. How is it just for this young girl to have died trying to save her sister? How can Langdon then hope to save his children? How can Dr. King hope to help her sister? As this reality sinks in, we are no longer kept at a distance, looking through the window of a closed door. We are forced to reckon with the excess emotion of the death of this young girl, the realities of mass shootings, addiction, domestic violence, sex trafficking, racism, misogyny. In linking melodrama with realism, the constraints of our social world have been revealed. It's an unsatisfying answer, but these effective experiences allow us as viewers to extend empathy to those in ethically confounding situations, even if it means accepting realities we would rather ignore. So unfortunately, it's time to turn to psychoanalysis, which is actually a shockingly big part of film studies. Now, here's a quote that prompted me to bring psychoanalysis into this video. Quote, lending itself to psychoanalytic and ideological readings, melodrama is often associated with the Freudian idea of a return of the repressed, according to which whatever remains unacceptable in the psychological or social life of characters, or impermissible within the ideologic framework of the narrative, returns in the form of aesthetic or dramatic excess. As we just discussed, the Pitt sees a lot of its characters attempt to seal themselves off from the melodramatic excess, attempting to preserve some kind of innocence that's actually incompatible with social reality. I would argue in this case, the return of the repressed takes the form of the various parallels between characters. That idea then made me think about another psychoanalytic theory, which is Jacques Lacan's mirror stage. Now, I'm just using this as a jumping off point, so please forgive any misreadings of the argument. It's really not the most coherent thing you're ever going to read, I'll tell you that much. But here's what I've gathered. The mirror stage is when an infant looks into a mirror for the first time and sees themselves as a whole unit. This is an error that Lacan defines as méconnaissance. The image both is and is not the self, and the infant prematurely presumes a mastery over itself that it does not actually have. Now, this idea can and has been extended past its original psychoanalytic conception to include the cinema. Oftentimes, it's used to theorize a relationship between cinema and spectator, where the camera itself acts as a kind of mirror, but it can also occur within the narratives on screen. In the context of the Pit, the intense excesses of the ER prompt its characters to suppress their emotion, resulting in what Lacan describes as a crisis of alienation. The characters can't exist as this unified version of themselves because they need to distance themselves from the reality surrounding them. Through their interactions with other characters, a piece of their psyche becomes manifested outside of their physical bodies. Now, there's a long list of relationships you could pull from as examples. I'm mostly going to be focusing on relationships involving Dr. Robbie just because he has a lot of screen time. And the first one I'm going to be talking about is between Dr. Robbie and Dr. Abbott. So they are both attending physicians in the ER at PTMC, and the season is kind of bookended by their friendship. One of the first scenes in the first episode takes place on the hospital roof, where Dr. Abbott is standing and contemplating why he keeps on coming back. Abbott is much more open about his mental health struggles generally, openly talking about going to therapy and suggesting to Robbie that he do the same. Robbie, on the other hand, is much more resistant. You can honestly characterize that as the driving force of the show, is Robbie's inability to deal with his emotions. His reluctance to face his emotions have dire consequences for the people around him, often resulting in very unempathetic bedside manner and eventually leading to a complete breakdown. He becomes paralyzed by the grief and emotions that he's been pushing down throughout the entirety of the shift and the entirety of his career. Abbott thus appears as a kind of externalized figure of a resolved version of Robbie's struggles, proof that Robbie is not this whole person he perceives himself to be, but a manifestation of the alienation Robbie feels from his own emotions. At one point in the season, Robbie reads out loud a letter that Abbott wrote to a war veteran who he was unable to save during his night shift. In this moment, Robbie is literally forced to embody a more complete and emotionally mature version of himself. Lacan writes, quote, "In the case of the migratory locust, the transition within a generation from the solitary to the gregarious form can be obtained by exposing the individual at a certain stage to the exclusively visual action of a similar image, provided it is animated by movements of a style sufficiently close to that characteristic of the species." So while Robbie is doing more than just mirroring Abbott's actions, as is described in this quote, he is literally forced to observe and embody Abbott's minds and actions, bringing him closer to a more resolved emotional state. The second relationship I want to talk about is between Robbie and Whitaker. Not in the way some of you might be thinking about it. Okay, I don't ship them, but that's your prerogative. Now, where Robbie and Abbott have a more egalitarian relationship, I would argue that Robbie views student Dr. Whitaker as an opportunity to resolve the alienation he feels within himself. The loss of Whitaker's first patient mirrors the loss of Robbie's mentor, and he even asks Robbie if he would have been eligible for the same kind of machine his mentor had been on. Robbie tells Whitaker that he should ask for help when he needs it, and that the only thing that he can do is move forward. The advice Robbie gives to Whitaker is then mirrored when Whitaker is the one to find Robbie having a panic attack during the MCI. It's Whitaker's words that are able to encourage him to get off the floor and get back to work. Robbie is too scared to ask for help himself, but he offloads it to a more complete version of himself, an externality that's easier for him to process. While Whitaker begins the season by having an excess of emotions he's unable to control, he ends the season by developing relatively healthy coping mechanisms. Robbie, on the other hand, sees his unhealthy coping mechanisms completely crumble throughout the season. Now, these are only two examples, but you can trace these throughout the entire season. Some other ones are McKay and Javadi, both dealing with being outside of their respected age ranges, Javadi treating a child prodigy, Langdon treating a patient with addiction, McKay treating many parents, Collins treating the abortion patient. All of these parallels, these returns of the repressed, are part of the melodramatic displacement of excess. What can't be processed internally must be worked out somewhere. Often, these experiences prompt deeper emotional reflections for the characters and the viewers who are watching these conflicts unfold. So that is basically everything I have to say about the Pitt. Except it's really not everything I have to say about the Pitt. This show is so rich with character dynamics. I could literally talk about it forever. I would like to thank anyone who watched this whole video, watched any part of this video. I would really like to hear anyone's thoughts in the comments on basically anything I spoke about, anything I didn't speak about, characters you love, characters you hate, anything. Listen, I'm all ears. I love talking about the Pitt, but my voice is gone, so I'm gonna have to let you go. But I hope everyone has a great weekend.